this video. I'm making this video because I think it's important to share something that not a lot of people are talking about, which is mental health within the Asian American community. And this survey was more done in regards to Asian Americans in corporate, but I'll share my screen. If you guys are watching through Facebook, I'm doing a LinkedIn Live, so check me out on LinkedIn. If you're not friends with me, please friend request me. But yeah, I'm excited to do this. This is a topic I'm very passionate about, and I have a lot to say in regards to this. So let me share my screen. So for context, there's something called Ascend, which is like an Asian leadership. So it's called Ascend Global Leaders. It's a nonprofit to help. And what they did is they did a mental health study so API stands for Asian and Pacific Islander professionals. So it's called Unpacking the Challenges. So I'll read you some of the quotes because I think it's interesting. So in the table of contents, you'll be able to see um what like a summary, why it's important, some of the myths, like understanding a little bit more about intergenerational trauma, and some of the challenges that come with being an Asian American in in the workplace. So the five main topics are around work-life balance, um, feeling invisible, recognition, leadership development, the stress and the trauma that comes, and we'll dig deeper into each of these national and global concerns, and then caregiving and personal health. So it's a pretty detailed summary, but essentially what happened was they surveyed about 1,000 people, and 74% said that work-life balance is a significant source of stress. So what that means is that there were 70% that felt exhausted mentally, and 60% felt stress at work. So the model minority myth, which we can get into a little bit more, 53% felt the pressures of the model minority myth. So we'll dig into a little bit deeper on what that means exactly. But these are and then I'll share some of my own experiences as well, because I do have thoughts on this topic. But so that's the first bucket. And the second bucket is feeling invisible, recognition, and leadership, and why we feel invisible. So the main themes are going to be around like 61% said imposter syndrome, 57% saying not being perceived as a leader, and being invisible to one's manager, 57%, microaggressions is 52%. So pretty heavy numbers for sure. And the accumulation of stress and trauma. So 6 out of 10 Asian Americans said that they're foreign born, so adapting to a new culture. And then for refugees, that's even more difficult. So, and then 40% said intergenerational trauma as a big source of stress. So each of these, I'll give you guys stories and just, yeah, and what my thoughts are on this. But I'm so glad that this study even exists. I know this is a topic that wasn't talked about like 10 years ago, and every year it seems like there's more and more representation. So I do appreciate a lot of this, but we still have a long way to go, because a lot of this that I'm sharing with you guys is probably going to be new to a lot of people. So, oh, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask ask me, and I'll try to look at it every now and then. But so the survey was talking about how Asian Americans had worse mental health than the average American. So 39% of Asians reported fair to poor mental health versus a fourth of the general American population, which is still pretty bad. Like more than a third versus a fourth of the population having poor mental health. Like that's definitely concerning. So they did a survey on the spot in the national convention by over 1,000 professionals, and 91% said that mental mental health has impacted their career growth. So let's dissect it a little bit, and I'll share with you my thoughts on each of these. So the first chapter I mean, obviously within the Asian American community, there's like a pretty diverse group of people, right? There's leaders, there's a lot of different ethnicities. So let's oh that doesn't look as good. So oh yeah, that kind of looks weird, huh? So uh so Dr. Vivek Murphy said that there's a lot of mental health, the relationship between physical and mental health. And because of the pandemic, I do think mental health is talked about a lot more, but it is still taboo, right? Like if you go up to your friends, unless it's a really close friend, you're not like, oh, I'm struggling with depression, right? This is stuff that you only talk about with like people that you're close to. And sometimes you don't even know that you are depressed, which is what makes it a bit harder to like figure out a solution. But there's still stigma. 55% of the survey of the 1,000 plus Asian Americans reported experiencing shame and negativity around mental health. So although it's super common, it's still not okay to talk about, and people have stigma. There's still a stigma around it. And they know that it's it's important to talk about it, but because of the stigma, it's still and honestly, there is a lack of knowledge on what to do. It's like, okay, I know that I'm depressed, but what should I do about it, right? So yeah, let's go a little bit deeper. Okay, so trauma, the reason why Asian Americans experience trauma differently from other Americans is because it shows up in silent ways, right? Like the way we process it as a community is shutting down, overachieving, people pleasing, and perfectionism. So as a result, it's not always recognized because we don't process it in very healthy ways, right? And there's self-judgment, there's a lot of invisible trauma as how we would classify that. So and everyone, it affects everyone differently as well, right? So the way I think about it is like when I'm triggered, I'm in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. And when I'm triggered, I'm obviously not in a good place, but it's like, well, what do I do? Like, how can I resolve this? Right. And um there's intergenerational trauma, and then there's microaggressions and stereotypes trauma, right? And being an Asian male, I would say it definitely affects your confidence in terms of like the lack of masculinity. Like even for me to grow like facial hair, it's pretty difficult. So there's a lot of nuances. Um, but the way I think about it is like, my family were refugees from Vietnam War, and anyone that has dealt with war knows like how it can really affect at a subconscious level or at a conscious level, how it really does a number on your confidence, right? So a lot of the stuff that my parents have gone through gets unconsciously passed on to me and my sisters without my parents really like, yeah, just really knowing that it even exists, right? A lot of this is at the unconscious level. Same with the Korean War and like India, Pakistan, like all that, the genocide in Cambodia, there's just the Sri Lankan Civil War, right? There's just a lot of war that like has affected us and has contributed to low self-esteem, right? And obviously, a lot of the South Asians and Islam phobia because of 9/11 that had a big impact in that community as well. Um, I don't know if anyone has listened to the Serial series, but that was like Asan. There's a lot of trauma that comes with being associated with that, right? With a lot of the terrorist groups looking a certain way, and then a lot of the prejudice that comes with that. So the shame is a big part of the AAPI experience because we want to save face, and it's interesting because a lot of the Asian families, like, we don't really hug each other. We don't really show affection as much as, like, what I've seen in a lot of my white friends. Their families, they're able to hug, they're able to communicate more effectively. A lot of Asians, like, we hold it in, and it's unfortunate. But, I think our generation, the new generation, is doing a better job with that. So that's something that I'm proud of. So, okay, these are the key points that are important to highlight. So 70% have mental exhaustion. Like I'll just speak for myself, but even for me, I feel like the last 6 months was the only time I was really able to take a break for first time in like, since I was 21, so that was 15 years ago. So first true break in 15 years because I feel like I have to prove myself and outperform my white counterparts because I put a lot of pressure on myself that if I don't perform, then they're never going to hire an Asian person again. So it's just a lot of pressure to put on yourself. And then 53% say that the model minority myth is a pretty significant source of stress. So people who don't know what the model minority myth is, it's basically like everyone expects Asians to be like the good minorities, right? It's like, oh, they'll shut up, they're not going to rebel, they're not going to cause any trouble, they're just going to like be silent, get their work done, and we don't have to worry about them. They're not going to cause any trouble. Well, as you can imagine, like that's pretty limiting, right? Like not being able to speak up and feeling like, oh, if I say anything, I'm gonna get fired. So 77% said that work is a significant source of stress. Like that's pretty out. That's pretty crazy. That's 3/4. I mean, I would agree. I think work is a significant source of stress. And I'm sure it's stress for a lot of people, but I would say within the Asian American community, it's even more prevalent because of how much value, how much attachment we have to our work, right? So, okay. 70, yeah, that's three, an average of 3.5 symptoms of burnout out of a possible 8 symptoms based on a modified 8-question burnout assessment. That's pretty ridiculous. There's also a lot of perfectionism within the Asian American community because we have a strong work. What did Edwin send me something? Let me just see. He said, oh, so it's a lot of pressure to be successful, and honestly, that amount of pressure can do a number on anyone. So, um, we do because we have good work ethic. It's almost like your winning formula, and I'll speak for myself, right? Because I can't speak for all of like the Asian American community, but I can just speak from my experiences. Like my work ethic has gotten to me to where I am now, right? But there's so many aspects like politics and being able to like go out drinking with the leaders and build your brand that way that a lot of Asians Americans like struggle with because like for me, like I lack the enzyme to drink a lot of alcohol. So for me, not being able to drink alcohol sometimes feels like I'm not able to network and get FaceTime with executives and things like that, right? Or just like the ability to like play golf, and there's so many little nuances to think about. So if you are a leader, like think to are you fostering an environment that fosters people for diversity, right? Or are we perpetuating what we know? Just things to think about. Okay. So it's it's interesting because of the model minority myth. It's called model minority, the double-edged sword. They portray Asians as hardworking, studious, and highly successful. And the reason why this is very, very stressful is because anyone that takes perfectionism to the extreme is it really does affect your mental and your physical health, right? So at the end of the day, the reason why I think a lot of Asians do have a perfectionism is because our parents, like they moved to the US, or, in some cases like great grandparents or grandparents, they moved to the US to hope in starting a better life, right? So during the World War II, a lot of Japanese Americans had to prove that they're Americans, and it's like, hey, like I'll work harder than everyone else. I'll prove you that I'll prove my loyalty, right? And just how we look, like for instance, when I see a white person, even if they're European and they have an accent, they still look white, right? So they're still accepted by mainstream media. where like, and then if they didn't speak, you wouldn't even know that they were like necessarily an immigrant a lot of times. Where for Asian Americans, yeah, you could be third generation Asian American and people be like, oh, your English is really good, or or just like a lot of these microaggressions. And it's crazy because it's like I was born in America. I still have never been to Asia, but and yet I still feel out of place sometimes, right? Like tell me how that works, right? That doesn't make any sense. It's like I'm not Asian enough for like certain Asian people because like I don't really, I've never been to Asia. But then according to Americans, like we're going to be labeled like as perpetual foreigners. So, this, oh man, this was like a very telling, a very relatable. So Rajana, who is a second generation Indian American, she's made it to a pretty high managing director at a big four firm. And she was talking about, I took a leave of absence from burning out for 6 months. And she's like, I've never felt more of a failure. And think about it, right? Like she doesn't have kids, she's not married. And what value of society placed on her is like, hey, I had this successful career, I went to a really good school. And losing that, like you can imagine the mental health and how that really does play a pull on your identity. So definitely helpful to work on mental health and think about these things that you're not thinking about regularly. Okay. Point two is the invisibility, which is something that I think about quite frequently. And it's interesting, right? It's like some of it is like, hey, am I not advocating for myself? Or is this like 61% of Asians have imposter syndrome? That's insane. That's a really high amount. That's 6 out of 10 people. Like, just sitting with that, that's a pretty incredible stat. And this part really resonated with me, which is so true, right? Like lack of representation in top boardrooms, C-suite, the U.S. history curriculum. Like I never read about any of this stuff really in history, right? Maybe one day, like not even a day associated with it. Mainstream media, um, just mainstream culture in general. There's not a ton of representation, although it is getting better. I'll give some credit where it's due, but still have a long way to go. So, um, yeah, it's interesting, right? It's there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of microaggressions. Stop Asian Hate was like a really big moment for us, and in some ways it helped us come together, but in some ways, it just showed that how much more work we have to do. So and it's even more sad to hear that Asian women have even more of stress and more imposter syndrome. So it's like double compound effect. So number three is just the intergenerational trauma stuff. It's it's interesting, right? There's two ways to look at it. You can view as trauma as something that like can really help you, or you could view it as something that's like extremely detrimental and like will really hurt you and your career. So it just depends on how you're able to adapt and the resilience that you build afterwards, right? But fair to say that refugees from Vietnam, Cambodians, Laos had extremely high PTSD, and I could speak from, experience, right? Being Vietnamese American, I could see the impact that has on a pretty deep level. So yeah, so Asian Pacific Islander women were twice likely as men to report it being a significant source of stress with intergenerational trauma stuff. So that's interesting how that's even why that is. Saving face is a really big concept because a lot of our parents like to brag about like, oh, my kid has this and did this, but it's comes from a place of lacking self-worth or feeling like I need to prove ourselves. And ultimately it doesn't really help, right? It just contributes to more and more mental health issues. Okay. So, okay. Okay. So let me see. there's overall 77% said that overall the racial climate in the US is a significant source of stress. And then half noted anti-Asian hate, right? Because of Trump, a lot of that stuff. I mean, this didn't happen overnight, right? There's everything from the Chinese Exclusion Act that didn't allow any any Asians into the US. So that was the genesis of that. And then obviously with 9/11, there's a lot of hate against Muslims and Sikhs and South Asians, people, Asians of darker skin color. Um, and yeah, it's and then bringing back to the point of being a perpetual foreigner, it's something that you don't really think about, but it's like really does affect you. You don't really feel like you belong in any of these cultures sometimes, being Asian American. So caregiving is an interesting topic because a lot of Asians tend to live with their elderly, so there's an added pressure. Whereas in, more typical white families, whether they come from generational wealth or even if they don't, there's less of a stress of being able to provide for your family, like your parents in that way. So there's a lot of stress that comes with that. It's like even with, our parents, right? Like me and my sisters talk, we're like, hey, like what's gonna happen there? Like we should start planning. And I'm not saying like white families don't have to deal with that, but I would say Asians give ourselves a lot more pressure when it comes to these things. So, I mean, the good and bad news, and it's not good to label, but it's like family becomes one of our biggest strengths, but it's also a big stress because we are just it's just a big part of our collectivism culture. So, something to consider. All right. Mental health wise, there's a lot of healing. Like, I think it is becoming more mainstream and people are talking about these topics a lot more, right? Like Buddhism and a lot of these like Eastern philosophies does help in terms of mindfulness. And there's something that I thought was interesting called post-traumatic growth, which is basically the ability to bounce back and be resilient, which I was like, huh, that's cool that we were able to put it in words like what that means. So, all right, about three-fourths of the way, a little bit past. So just things like qigong and reiki and yoga, right? A lot of these what Eastern practices are becoming popular in the US and North America because of a lot of these things. So, um, what do we do from here, right? It's like embrace the power of community, right? Being able to get value outside of work. Like this is a great story where he was a director and Newton just talked about like how he felt like he failed as a husband and a father, but he's doing really well business wise. But it's like, as we all know, it's important to also have a good relationship with your family and things like that. So in conclusion, I hope this is helpful. This is something that is near and dear to my heart. And yeah, if you like this type of content, feel free to ask questions, and I'll be more than glad to answer any more questions that you all might have. Cheers. All right, that was cool.